Well, it feels like I've been sanding on this bass guitar body for days. And that's probably because, well, I have. I think we've got all the sanding complete and now are at a point where we can actually work on getting this thing all assembled. We've got a lot of work yet to do, so make sure you stick around because at the end of this video, I'm hoping to hear some bass sounds coming out of this. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Home Built Workshop. We're back on the SubTonic bass guitar. This is episode number 3. As I mentioned in the intro, sanding. I've got this entire body sanded up to 600 grit. It's silky smooth, just about ready for finish. There's one thing that I need to do yet. Probably should have done that before I started sanding. I need to drill a hole for the output jack. I'm going to be using this football-shaped jack plate for the jacks on this build. Really simple to install. I just need to drill a 7/8 hole. That's about the size of the jack so it can actually recess into the body. This isn't the actual jack plate. I'm using a chrome one, but it's not here yet, so we're just going to use this for testing purposes. When locating the jack, I like to put it dead center on the body. To make that really easy, I've got a little homemade center finder. We're just going to put that on there. Use a pencil. Very carefully mark out a center line. For some reason, I always double check that to make sure that my line is actually centered, even though I know it is. Now to drill this hole, that's where things can get a little tricky, and if you're not really careful, things will go sideways pretty quick. I use a 7/8 Forstner bit, and I've drilled a bunch of these by hand, but the challenge is getting everything straight so that the hole goes at the correct angle. You don't want to drill it sideways, then you have a hard time getting the jack in there, and sometimes you have to go in there and maybe enlarge the hole if you drill a little bit crooked. So I tried to come up with a little bit better way to drill this hole nice and straight. Enter this thing. This is a very crude, and I want to emphasize the word crude, prototype for a jig that I may or may not be experimenting with making. Really all this is a block of maple. It's got a bronze bushing in there that fits my Forstner bit, and really all this is a drill guide. This thing eventually may get a base, but for now, I've just got this bottom edge perfectly square, ran it on my joiner to make sure that it's 90 degrees, and we're just going to clamp this to the table. It's spaced in exactly the right spot that hopefully it lines up with the mark we just made on the body, and then I can just drill away and it'll keep everything nice and straight. Now we'll bring our guitar body over, and I'll just make sure that the drill bit lines up with the mark that I made. That looks good. I'll line this up so that the drill bit is going the direction that I want it to. Clamp our body down. Now we'll just put our drill on our bit. And I know from testing and trying this out that this drill bit's getting dull. So it may be a little bit of a challenge to drill through this, but I think we'll get there. The smoke is getting in my eye. That bit is getting hot. Hopefully we can get through this. And we're through. Pretty sure I saw an ember. There we go. A nicely centered hole for our output jack. That bit got a little bit hot. Pretty sure it's time for a new one. At least we got through this one last drilling job. With the hole drilled for the output jack and all the sanding complete, we're ready to start applying finish, at least to the body. I knew from the beginning of this project that I wanted to do an oil finish on the body as well as the neck. If you've seen any of my other guitar neck videos, you'll know that I'm pretty partial to an oil finish on a neck. It is my favorite. It's my go-to finish for a neck. It just feels silky smooth. It doesn't get sticky like a poly or a lacquer, and it's really my favorite type of finish. I want to use that on the neck as well as the body. But what finish are we going to use? I'm going to use some Osmo oil for this build. Now I've experimented with Osmo in the past, but this one is a little bit different. Based on my research, this is a little bit more durable than some of the other Osmo oils. This is the Osmo TopOil. It's meant for things like countertops and stuff like that. It's food safe. Not that we're going to be eating off of our guitar, but it is a blend of oils and wax, and it's supposed to be water repellent, wear resistant. Hopefully it'll hold up pretty good. I'm sure it's going to feel nice once we get it all done. All we gotta do is apply it, which is actually quite easy. I'm just gonna use this microfiber cloth, kind of like a tack cloth, I guess. Make sure we have all the dust and things off the wood, out of the pores as best we can. Just use a little brush to make sure that there's nothing stuck in any of the cavities. Just trying to get it as clean as possible. I'm gonna hang this up on a piece of wire and we'll start applying the finish. Apparently they sell some sort of applicator pads and things like that that you can apply this finish with. I'm just using a rag, an old cotton t-shirt. It's been run through the dryer so that there's ideally no lint. Now you may be thinking, well, why aren't you doing the neck at the same time? But don't worry, there is a method to my madness. This particular product requires 8 to 10 hours for the first coat to dry. Then you apply a second coat, wait another 8 to 10 hours, and basically you're done. I still have a fair bit of work to do on the neck, so my thought is, while this is sitting the 8 to 10 hours, I can be working on the neck, getting the frets installed, finish sanding that, then hopefully, once this is finally done, I can get the finish on the neck and move on to starting some assembly on the body while the neck is curing. So that's my theory anyway. Hopefully it works out. I'm gonna set this aside in a safe place, let this finish cure, and we can start working on the neck. With the body tucked away safely, we'll just wait for that finish to cure. That means we've got plenty of time to get some frets installed in this neck. I've got everything set up here, my fret press, fret wire bender, nippers, all that stuff. We're ready to get started. I've gone through and made sure all the fret slots are clean. There's no sawdust in there. I've vacuumed everything out. That way I know it's nice and clean. Remember, these are blind fret slots. So that means before we can put the fret in, we've got to nip off a little bit of the fret tang on either end. It's exactly the same thing you would do if you were installing frets in a neck that has binding on it. We'll first bend up a piece of fret wire. I always check my fret wire. I want to make sure it's bent a little bit more than the radius of the fretboard. This needs to go just a tiny bit more. I don't know if you can see that. We're just a little bit overbent. That helps keep the ends down tight when you press the fret wire in place. My first step is to cut the fret roughly to length. Then I'll use these specially made nippers to cut the tang off of either end of the fret. This is the 24th fret due to the shape I have of the fretboard. It's just a little short guy. I'm going to get all of these cut and the tang nipped off before I start pressing them in. That way I can kind of work in stages. That's the last one. Now we can take all of these frets and install them in all of these fret slots, and we'll see how many times I cut myself, because if you know fret ends, I don't know why, they just seem like tiny little razor blades, and I always somehow scratch or cut myself, so just be careful. Fret ends are extremely sharp till you have them filed and dressed. Also, I'm going to do something a little bit different this time around. I'm going to use a little bit of glue in the fret slots just to glue these in. I don't glue my frets every single time, but I'm going to try it this time around, see how it works out. To spare you some of the repetition, I'll walk you through the process, and once you see how I do one, you're going to know exactly how I do all the rest. We'll start off with this little guy here. This is the tiny little 24th fret. On my glue bottle, I've got this little tiny whip tip here. That's going to help me keep the glue in the slot and hopefully not all over the fretboard. And then we press it in. Let's do one more. So the process is very simply tiny bit of glue, add our fret, and press it in. I watch really closely as I go just to make sure that the frets are seating fully. These look great. I don't think I'd change anything. I think we're good to go. That's my process. I'm just going to repeat that 22 more times and we'll have a fully fretted neck. And I guess the next step is going to be to flush up these ends, get everything beveled and nice and flat. Once I have all the frets in, I'll grab my homemade fret end files and get the frets filed flush to the edge of the neck. Then I'll switch over to my beveling file and put a very slight bevel on the ends of the frets. I have a full video of making these two files on my channel. It is a bit of an older video, but these files are still working great. I'll put a link in the description if you want to see how I made them. I like to file my bevels until it is just cut off the very sharp corner of the fretboard. I'm not trying to take off much, but I want to cut the frets all the way down and just a tiny bevel cut into the fretboard. That makes the edge of the fretboard initially sort of rolled over. It takes off that sharp corner and really, I think, plays an important part in keeping that fretboard comfortable because you don't have to really sand all that much later on because you've already taken off that sharp corner. And that's how I know when I'm done. Once I'm all done filing, everything looks good. You should be able to hold it up to a light to where the light reflects off that beveled end. And you should be able to see a slight line down the edge of the fretboard as well as the fret ends. And that's how I can tell that I'm done filing and ready to move on. There's one last little bit that I need to take care of, and that's this last fret here where it's in this little contour. I can't use the beveling file because of the curve, so we're going to resort to very carefully drummeling that nice and smooth. That feels pretty good. We'll be able to clean up the end, put a little bevel on that by hand with a file later on. We're now ready to break out the carving buck and get this neck final shaped, sanded. There's not a whole lot of shaping left to do because most of it was done on the machine, but I did leave this a little bit thick so that I have some room for some final contours. If we come in a little bit closer, you can see there's just a little bit of a squared off edge here. Like I said, because I left some material so that I can shape this by hand and get it exactly where I want it. Most of the shaping is done. I just need to blend this in and do a bunch of sanding. This process shouldn't take anywhere near the amount of time as it does to shape this by hand. I'm not even going to start off with a file. I've just got a flat stick here with some different grits of sticky back sandpaper on there. I think that's going to work pretty good, and it'll save us from getting any nasty file marks. If you're watching right now thinking, hey, you didn't install any side marker dots yet, well, you'd be absolutely correct. And normally I would have those all installed at this step. The only reason I don't is because, well, I had to order the material and it hasn't showed up yet. So I'm trying to keep this project moving along and do what I can. I'm going to try to be very careful at this step not to touch the edges of the fretboard just yet. I do need to contour that into the radius, but I want to leave those square for now so that when the material arrives, I can drill those holes nice and square. If I already sand them and they're not quite square anymore, then it's really hard and your drill bit can wander. So I'm just going to do what I can. Hopefully that fretboard material, the marker material, will be here very soon. Well, would you look at that? Our side dot material showed up. So let's stop what we're doing and get these things installed. I already have the locations of the side markers laid out on the neck, so all I really need to do is drill the correct hole, and this is the reason I waited for this material to show up. I don't ever want to assume that I have the right size drill bit. I want the actual stock in hand so that I can do a test piece first, just to make sure everything fits good. Now, somewhere around this tiny shop, I have a jig that I use specifically for this task, but for some reason, I can't find it. Who knew you could lose something in such a tiny space? So here, I'm just using the fence on my drill press to carefully keep everything in alignment. To install these side marker dots, it's super simple. I'm just taking the stock, dipping it in a little bit of super glue, tapping it into the hole, and then trimming it off mostly flush. I say mostly flush because I'm not super concerned with cutting it exactly flush at this time. We'll be able to clean all of that up once we get back to the sanding stage, which, unfortunately for me, is right now. I'm going to spend the next several hours sanding up through the grits until I have a nice silky smooth finish on all surfaces. For some reason at this point in the process, my audio quit working and I have absolutely no sound. Now this is kind of a drag because I had just finished sanding right here in this clip, and I was explaining how my next steps were going to be to add the logo and serial number and all that good stuff using my laser engraver. So I suppose let's just jump right over to the laser and hopefully we have sound again. Once again, I've got another jig, just a negative cutout of the neck just to help align everything. Fits right down in there. We're ready to put the logo on. After engraving the Hayley Guitars logo onto the headstock, I flipped the jig and the neck 180 degrees, and on the back of the headstock, engraved a serial number and some other information. It is super cool being able to laser engrave your parts. It's now time to get the finish applied. I'm just going to wipe off all of the dust, make sure everything's nice and clean. I'm going to use the same Osmo finish on the neck as I did on the body, but I've got a little bit more information on applying this Osmo. When I put the finish on the body, remember I said you apply one coat, wait 8 to 10 hours, and then you apply a second coat. Well, apparently there's just a teensy bit more to that I failed to read on the instructions. While I was sanding on the neck, I did stop and go back and apply that second coat of finish to the body. But when I did that, I realized that the finish on the body wasn't quite as smooth as I'd expected it to be. There was some fine lines and stuff in there left by, I'm assuming, the cotton rag that I used to apply it. Well, after a little bit of investigation and reading the instructions a little bit further, which I probably should have done in the first place, I found out that they say you're supposed to wipe on a coat, let it tack up, and then you wipe off the excess. Well, I didn't do that the first time around. And after I did that process on the second coat, the finish came out so much better. So I guess maybe on occasion it's okay to go ahead and read the instructions. Now, when I look at the instructions on the can does not say anything about letting it get tacky and then wiping off the excess. I didn't learn that until I went to the Osmo website, where they had some more information on there, some of the data sheets and things, and it specifically says wipe on a light coat, wait about 10 minutes or so for it to start to get tacky, and then wipe off the excess with a clean cloth. Doesn't say that on the can, but it says it on the website. So that is the process I used for the second coat on the body, although I didn't wait 10 minutes because in my environment here, finishes dry super fast, so it really only took 4 or 5 minutes, and I just went back with a clean rag and wiped off the excess, and it's so much better. While I was reading the instructions, I saw that it said something about like a flannel pad or something along those lines, and I got to thinking, well, maybe a microfiber cloth will work well, and that's what I used on the body. It works great. The process I'm going to use is a microfiber cloth to apply the finish. I'm going to let it just get tacky, which in my environment only takes a few minutes. Then I'll use another piece of clean microfiber, wipe off the excess with the wood grain, and it's going to work great. Now I've got my clean microfiber. We'll just clean off any excess. I've got a little piece of wire here. I'm just going to hang this up, let it dry for about 8 hours, and then apply a second coat, and then we should be ready to start assembling this thing. Well, we are done with the finishing process. It's now time to start assembling this thing. The first thing I want to do is get the neck bolted into place, but before I do that, I need to drill one set of access holes so that I can run the wiring for the pickups. I'm going to use this extra long 5/16 drill bit and drill basically right on my center line all the way down through. That's going to allow me to route the wires from the neck pickup down through the bridge pickup, and then we'll drill another hole that goes kind of at an angle down into the control cavity. When I drill these kinds of holes, I like to take a little piece of cardboard. This is like a scrap from a cereal box, and I put that in the neck pocket. That gives me just a tiny bit of a spacer to keep the hole right off the bottom, and it also protects the neck pocket from getting gouged by the drill bit. This way I can keep the drill bit flat on the neck pocket and it's not going to scratch it up. It's going to ride on this piece of cardboard and I'll be able to get a nice straight square hole and not damage the neck pocket. It makes a horrible noise too. I also like to use my piece of cardboard at this step as well. This just kind of prevents any scratching or damaging of the finish. There's our hole where our wire will pass into our control cavity. There's one last very important detail that I need to add to this body, and that's the Hayley Guitars logo using my branding iron. I'm not using the laser here because I can't get down into the neck pocket. Now we can assemble it. The first piece of hardware to go on will be the grommets for the screws that'll secure the neck. I just press them into place and make sure they're fully seated using a hammer and a brass punch. Now I'll press the neck into place, making sure it's fully seated on all sides, and using a drill bit that just fits through the bolt holes, I'll mark the location on the neck as to where I need to drill the pilot holes. After putting the neck in place, it's time to bolt this on. I'm using a little bit of candle wax to rub onto these screws. I don't ever install these without a wax because it helps to keep the screw from binding, and your chances of breaking a screw off are much less by using a little bit of wax. Doesn't mean you can never break them off still, it just helps prevent that. Another thing I do to help prevent breaking the screws is I never use an impact driver. Once in a while, I'll use an impact to maybe remove some screws, but to install them, I never use an impact. I want to feel what the screw is doing. If it feels like it's starting to bind, sometimes I'll just run the screw backwards a couple of times, like you were tapping the hole. And I've had really good luck. As long as you do it by hand, use a regular old screwdriver. Yes, I know, it takes just a little bit longer doing it manually, but how much extra time are you going to spend trying to remove a broken screw? It's well worth it to take a little longer at this step than trying to rush through. I know we're really close to being done. I want to get this done just as much as anybody else, but I also don't want to break a screw. This one feels like it's going a little bit hard. When that happens, I'll just pull it back out, add just a little more wax, neck installed. Next, I'll focus on installing the pickups. First, I'll drop them into place, and then using the screws that came with the pickups, I'll make a little indent where I need to drill some pilot holes. After drilling the pilot holes, I'll wax up the screws and install the pickups. These have a little piece of surgical tubing which gets mounted below the pickup. After I installed the bridge pickup, I realized I was going to have to remove it later to drill the hole for the bridge ground. Not really a big deal, but I did do this later on. And it's time for some tuners. I use Godot tuners on pretty much all of my builds, and that's what I'm using here. I really like the quality of the Godot compared to the price. I think they're a really good value, and they work well too. So now I'm ready to locate and install the bridge. Now, this is a step where I gotta kind of slow down, take my time, make sure I get this right. Even though this is cut on a CNC machine, I do not want to assume that the center line between my two halves of the body are gonna exactly line up on the center line of the bridge. This bridge has 5 holes, and it's fairly safe to assume that the center hole is gonna go on the center line. But I'm not just gonna assume that. We're going to do a little bit of checking, and to do that, we got to go fishing. Okay, not really fishing, but I am going to use fishing line as kind of temporary strings just to make sure that everything lines up. I've got a temporary nut here that I'm going to just drop in. This is not the one I'm going to use. It doesn't even really fit the slot well. I just need something to kind of hold the strings so that I can sort of string this up with some fishing line. So I've taken a piece of this fishing line and sort of ran it as the 2 outermost strings. It's not really under much tension, but it does give me a good visual as to where the strings are going to land. I've got the bridge lined up on the center line, and as I pull this line tight, I can see that my fishing line is in fact centered on the neck. Now I can just measure out my 32-inch scale length. I'm making sure I leave some room for a little bit of compensation. I want to make sure I have room down here to move these forward as well as back. I know the base side's going to have to come back a fair bit. And I believe that bridge needs to live right there. You guys ever get just some random song stuck in your head and you don't recall ever hearing it? Recently anyway? It happens to me all the time. Let me know down in the comments what song is stuck in your head right now. Sometimes it's not even a song you like. I don't mind it when it's a good song. Sometimes it's a terrible song and it just won't go away. I can't be the only one that ever happens to. I'm just putting on what I believe is the last actual piece of hardware. That's going to be the strap buttons. And then we're about ready to string this up. I've got all the electronics and everything in place. I still have to do some wiring yet, but that's something I'm going to do off camera. Now I've been asked a few times, hey, why don't you show a little bit more about your wiring? We want to see how you wire this and that and the other thing, and really there's a couple of reasons why I kind of don't go too in-depth on the wiring. The first off is, really, I'm not an electronics whiz. I just follow schematics and wire things up as the diagram shows. Most of the time, that works just fine. I don't get too technical with things. I like my instruments pretty simple. This one's going to be simply a volume, a tone, and a selector switch, kind of going guitar style. You'll probably have seen some of the basses that have, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 different knobs on there for different things. I don't need anything anywhere near that, and I can't imagine trying to wire all that up. It's got to be a nightmare and look like just a bowl full of spaghetti underneath the control plate. But I keep things pretty simple. Most of the diagrams you can find online, and in fact, in almost every set of pickups I've ever bought, they come with at least some form of a schematic. This is not exactly the one I'm going to use. This one has a separate volume for each pickup in a master tone control. It's a very common layout, and if that's what you want for your instrument, pretty simple to find. I'm wiring mine up just exactly the same as I would like a double humbucker guitar. I'm not going to have any coil splitting or anything like that. These are passive pickups, so no preamp, nothing like that. Really keeping it simple. And really, the second reason is because what I choose to wire mine as, someone else may not like. And there's just so many different options. There are a ton of great resources online. One of them would be the Seymour Duncan website. Not sponsored or anything, but if you go to their website, you can search up schematics for just about any configuration you can find. I print those things out and I've got them taped up all over the place for different applications. There's other websites as well if you're looking for different wiring diagrams and that sort of thing. There's just, I don't think there's really one size fits all kind of thing, if that makes any sense. But I'm going to get this wired up. We're going to string it up. And then we'll check out the final results. It is so awesome to be at this step. I'm going to get this done and we'll check out the final piece. Well, after over a year in the making, maybe even 2, I'd like to introduce you to the Hayley Guitars SubTonic Bass Guitar. The first SubTonic is right here. It's awesome! I cannot tell you how happy I am and how satisfying it is to have this in my hands so that I can play it. It's been a long time in the making and it turned out awesome. A little recap on some of the specs. We got an elm body. We've got a hard maple neck, Powell ferrule fretboard, spalted maple fretboard markers. This one, of course, is a 4-string model. We've got a Goto bridge, Seymour Duncan pickups, CTS pots, switch. We have Goto tuners. Just turned out awesome. So let's plug this thing in and make a little bit of noise. At least demonstrate that everything works. A little disclaimer though, I am not a bass player. I don't pretend to be a bass player. I don't play one on TV. I don't claim to be a bass player. This is the first left-handed bass I've ever owned in my entire life. So bear with me on that. In fact, I don't even own a bass amp. This is just my 50-watt Boss Katana. I'm gonna run things through there. Should be plenty to be able to just make a little bit of noise. So, but now that I have this instrument, I do plan on doing a little bit more practicing and learning some different things, but let's test it out. Volume works. Tone works. Everything works, all the controls work. Now this guitar's not even fully set up yet. I haven't even leveled and crowned the frets. This is exactly how they were after I installed them. So I've got some work to do yet, but I was too excited and I wanted to get out here and try this thing out. Well, at least I hope you get the idea. Everything works as it should. Like I said, I've still got some setup to do on it, but I cannot be happier having this done. It's been a long time in the making, and I'm super happy and really satisfied to see this thing come to life. If you've been following along on this build, first I want to say thank you. I appreciate you sticking around. I know this has been really in the works for quite some time. Thanks for following along. I really appreciate all of you. And also, let me know down in the comments what you think now that this is finally done. It's awesome. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time.